It's 331 BC, in the ancient city of Rome, and the people are gripped by a fear of what is thought to be a plague, as many prominent men fall ill and die. Panic sweeps the city until the truth comes out. A slave girl exposes the conspiracy of Roman matrons that had been secretly poisoning these men. Acting on her tip, officials raided a gathering of noble women and found them brewing the toxic poisons. 20 accused matrons, led by 2 patricians named Cornelia and Sergia, insisted their poisons were medicinal. Challenged to prove their innocence by drinking their own brew, they all did so. And lo and behold, they all dropped dead, victims to their own poison. Subsequent interrogations implicated 170 women in total, an unprecedented wave of murders. Livy, our source for this historical episode, notes that until that day there had never been a trial for poisoning in Rome, and that the sheer scale of the crime was regarded as a prodigy, suggesting madness rather than criminal intent. Let's put it into other words. Romans were so astonished by what we might call a serial murder spree that they ascribed it to collective insanity or a curse, rather than pure bloodlust and malice. It's an early case that sets the stage for our investigation today. The Romans knew serial murder in various guises, even if they explained it in their own cultural terms. And so today, here we are, to talk about a often overlooked aspect of Roman history. Something that, underneath all the battles, the triumphs and the glories, flies a little bit under the radar, and perhaps in that glorious spectacle of Rome, it's something that they wish to sweep under the rug a little. But we're going to sift through the historical and literary evidence today, and we're going to shine a light on some notorious figures, from the poisoners lurking in the shadows, all the way up to those emperors whose bloody reigns terrorized the empire. Our journey is going to take us from these lesser-known cases, like those repeat murderers in the late Republic, to the imperial palace, where we have characters such as Caligula, Nero, and Commodus, turning the apparatus of state into instruments of personal bloodlust. We don't often think of people in such high positions of power as serial killers, but the numbers do not lie, and that pile of bodies over there is a little bit difficult to ignore. We'll examine how Roman law eventually evolved to address these repeated killings, and how Roman society reacted with a mix of fear or fascination, how the cultural memory enshrined these killers or even tried to erase them. And finally, we'll go into that shadowy world of professional poisoners, like Locusta, a woman who could be well called an ancient serial killer for hire, given her deadly resume at the court of Nero. But before we do, I want to welcome you to the channel. A heartfelt welcome to this rather disturbing topic of a video today, but it seems those are the popular ones. We're going to be going through different accounts like Livy, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio. I hope you're familiar with them. If not, you can look them all up. They're all readily available. And if you are new to the channel, I do invite you to click the subscribe button if you've not done so yet, the like button, and leave a comment where you are. This video is completely ad-free, along with the rest of the videos on the channel, due to the generous contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, and those who took the chance to have a look at the merch store. Thank you very much. If you want to support the channel, I don't need to explain to you how to do it. Just click those links in the description or pinned comment. You'll find where you need to go. Now, with that all out of the way, let us get down to the topic at hand. It's going to be a very deep dive into this. Let's enjoy ourselves, shall we? Before examining specific cases, let's just clarify some terms. This word, or rather combination of words, serial killer, it's a more modern concept. It's defined as someone who murders at least 2 or 3 people in separate events, often with a psychological motives. Now, if we go back to Roman sources, Latin phrases, there's no direct equivalent term. There's no Latin phrase that neatly translates to serial killer. Instead, repeated murderers fell under broad categories like parricidium, that is murder of a close relatives, veneficium, poisoning, and sicariorum, that is assassination or banditry. Romans were certainly familiar with serial acts of murder, that's for sure, but they interpreted them through the lens of family intrigue, tyranny, or supernatural evil, rather than our modern psychology. So keep a broad mind as we move forward with our terminology. Now, for example, multiple murders by the same person might be seen as something politically motivated, as in the case of a dictator executing enemies, or perhaps driven by greed and deceit, as with the women who poisoned their husbands. Often serial murderers were pigeonholed into categories of crime that the ancient Romans understood, such as the aforementioned veneficium, which means poisoning, but also connoted magical malice. Notably, Roman authors show a recurring gendered perspective. Poisonings were frequently blamed on women. In fact, a Roman rhetorician quipped, meaning, "There is no adulteress who isn't a poisoner." Well, this hyperbole from Quintilian's Institutes work shows a stereotype that an unfaithful wife might secretly kill her husband, a trope born of several high-profile cases in Rome. So while Romans didn't conceptualize, quote, serial killers as a distinct species of criminal, they absolutely recorded instances of people who killed again and again. And so by reading between the lines of their narratives, filtering out legend and moralizing, we can identify individuals who fit the profile of our character of a serial murderer. Some did it clandestinely, others did it openly, whether it was poisoners in the dark or emperors right out there in the open. And so, let's look at both lesser-known cases that crept into historical record and, of course, infamous imperial killers, whose names still, to these days, ring with infamy. We'll start moving forward with the lesser-known case studies. We already recounted the poisoning conspiracy of 331 BCE, a remarkable early case of mass serial homicide by Roman women. But after 331, episodic poison panics continued to haunt Rome. In 180 BC, during another bout of mysterious deaths, the authorities again suspected poisoners. One case stands out. The newly elected consul, Tiberius Minucius, died all of a sudden. The blame fell solely on his wife, Quarta Hostilia. Livy recounts that Hostilia had an ulterior motive, you see. Her son from a previous marriage, Quintus Flaccus, stood to gain political advancement if the consul, his stepfather, died. Indeed, when Flaccus soon won the vacant office, the rumors only grew louder. Witnesses came forward recounting that Hostilia had boasted that she would make her son consul within a number of months. It's not looking very good for her, isn't it? Under investigation by the praetor, Hostilia was convicted of murdering her husband on mere suspicion, according to the surviving summaries. And her fate was grim, likely handed over to her relatives for execution by strangulation, customary for noble women convicted of capital crimes. The Hostilia affair suggests that even in the Republican era, Romans feared serial poisoners lurking in elite households, though it probably also had the effect of making husbands a little bit more nicer to their wives. Well, a few decades later, in 154 BC, an even more ominous report emerges. 2 consulars were said to have been poisoned by their wives. The details are sparse, since Livy's books survive only in summary here, but Valerius Maximus, a first-century writer, confirms the allegations too. 2 former consuls died seemingly out of nowhere with no explanations. Once again, their own wives were implicated in administering poison, suggesting a coordinated scheme or copycat crimes. While specifics are lost to time, Roman historians treated these incidents as part of a pattern of private poisoning that plagued society. Copycat killers, inspired by the worst possible deeds. And indeed, by the late Republic, poisoning had become so common that in 82 BC the dictator Sulla passed the Lex Cornelia de Sicaris e Veneficus, a law specifically targeting assassins and poisoners. This law treated multiple murders as an especially heinous category. It criminalized not just the act of killing, but the manufacturing and distribution of poisons for murder. Initially, violators, especially the nobles, might be punished by exile or property confiscation. But over time, the punishment stiffened. A later senatorial decree, that is, Senatus Consultum in Latin, even decreed that if a woman gave a potion to induce miscarriage or conception and it caused death, well, she would be banished. By the 3rd century CE, in the jurist Marcian's day, convicted serial poisoners of low status were executed, often thrown to wild beasts in the arena, while those of higher status were exiled, reflecting once again Rome's class-based justice. The very need for such laws indicates that repeat murder by poison was certainly a very real societal concern. But beyond these legal and anecdotal records, rumors of serial killers swirled around certain individuals. Roman aristocrats sometimes died conveniently and in clusters, sparking gossip of a hidden hand. One famous target of rumor was Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus. Tacitus and others hint that Livia possibly hastened the deaths of several rivals to clear the path for her son Tiberius's succession. The early deaths of Marcellus, Augustus's nephew, Agrippina Postumus, grandson, and even Augustus himself were, in later gossip, attributed to Livia's scheming, using poison and other means, essentially painting her as a serial poisoner at the heart of the imperial family. But these claims remain unproven and controversial, likely amplified by those old tropes of the wicked stepmother. Still, the persistence of the accusations in our source shows the Roman imagination could conceive of a woman systematically committing multiple murders to achieve her ends. And then we have another example. It comes from the early empire, the case of Locusta and Martina, professional poisoners. We will discuss Locusta in depth shortly, but we'll just go over it briefly now. Martina was a woman from Syria, implicated in the suspected poisoning of Germanicus, that is the popular heir of Tiberius, around AD 19. According to Tacitus, after Germanicus' sudden death, Martina, infamous for evil arts apparently, was arrested. En route to Rome for trial, she mysteriously died. And guess what? Poison was found hidden in her belongings, and that suggests that she took her own poison to avoid torture, which was probably a wise decision. While Martina's guilt was never legally confirmed, she epitomized the figure of a serial poisoner for hire. Such women operating in the shadows could accumulate multiple victims over years, leaving scant evidence beyond the whispered accusations. So, let's discuss Locusta in a lot more detail. Locusta of Gaul, that is, perhaps the closest thing to a professional serial killer documented in Roman history. In fact, her career reads kind of like a lurid novel of sorts. She was a woman adept in concocting poisons, responsible for multiple high-profile murders in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Her activities spanned the reigns of Claudius and Nero, and the primary sources portray her as an instrument of murder, repeatedly employed by those in power. It's a hell of a career choice, that's for sure. Tacitus introduces Locusta in his Annals at the poisoning of Emperor Claudius in AD 54. Empress Agrippina the Younger, Claudius's wife and Nero's mother, by the way, was resolved to eliminate Claudius to secure Nero's succession. She, according to the source, did not lack instruments for the crime, and chose a person skilled in such matters, Locusta by name, who had lately been condemned for poisoning and long retained as one of the tools of despotism. Locusta prepared a toxic potion, famously smeared on a dish of mushrooms, Claudius's favorite treat, by the way. The emperor unwittingly consumed the gift of the goddess, as Nero later darkly joked, since mushrooms became Claudius's death warrant. When the poison initially only made Claudius ill, they went to Plan B. According to Tacitus and Suetonius, Claudius's physician slipped a poisoned feather down the groaning emperor's throat to finish the job. And so Claudius died, and Nero ascended the throne. He was only 17, by the way, when he did this. Locusta's reward for this service is not explicitly detailed at that moment, but Agrippina's patronage likely saved her from punishment. She had been lately condemned, but was evidently pardoned to perform this task. The successful poisoning of an emperor immediately cemented Locusta's vast reputation for crime, as Tacitus calls it. And barely months later, in AD 55, Locusta was called upon again, this time by Nero himself. The target was Britannicus, Claudius's teenage son and Nero's stepbrother, who was, by the way, a potential rival for the throne. Suetonius and Tacitus both give gripping accounts of Britannicus's murder, illustrating how Nero used Locusta as his lethal weapon. Nero felt threatened by 14-year-old Britannicus's claim, and even jealous of the boy's singing voice, apparently. And so he decided to eliminate him. He employed for this purpose Locusta, as Suetonius writes. The first dose Locusta prepared was slipped into Britannicus's drink during a banquet. In the candlelit dining room, Britannicus took a sip and immediately was seized by agony. But this was not an instantaneous death. The poison was too weak for that. It caused Britannicus to vomit, but not die. Nero was not impressed by this. Furious, in fact, suspecting Locusta had given a mere purgative to avoid detection. The young emperor dragged the poisoner into a private room and beat her with his own hands, accusing her of betraying him with an antidote. Locusta pleaded that she only used a gentle mixture to avoid suspicion, but Nero had scoffed. "Do you think I fear the Julian law against poisoning?" He personally ordered her to brew a new, far deadlier dose on the spot, right there and then. And what follows is, well, it sounds like something from some kind of thriller film. Locusta, under imperial threat, prepared a potion that was very, very potent, right there in Nero's chamber as the emperor watched. They tested it on a young goat, and when the goat lingered alive for a few hours, Nero demanded an even stronger concoction. The next batch was tested on a slave, and the slave died immediately. Nero was quite satisfied at this, and he had the poison poured into Britannicus's cup at the next opportunity, during a grand dinner. Poor old Britannicus gulped it all down and collapsed at once. Apparently, according to Suetonius, as if he was struck by lightning. Amid the panic of guests, Nero coolly claimed that the boy was simply having an epileptic seizure. That was an illness that Britannicus was known to have. But by the next day, Britannicus was well and truly dead, and hastily buried. This cold-blooded sequence, documented by Suetonius and corroborated by Tacitus, shows Locusta's central role. She essentially acted as Nero's personal murder weapon, adapting her poisons to ensure a swift kill at her master's whim. Of course, Nero richly rewarded her for her effective, if ghoulish, service. Suetonius states that Nero granted Locusta a full pardon for her past crimes and lavished her with gifts, among them a large country estate. In a detail that truly shows her status as a serial killer mentor, we learn that Nero placed some disciples with her to be instructed in the trade. Yes, he founded what we might call a school of poisoning, and Locusta was the head professor. He trained others in the art of assassination by toxins. It seems Nero envisioned an assembly line of expert poisoners at his disposal. Locusta, once a condemned criminal, now enjoyed imperial favor and even a perverse kind of academic tenure in Nero's court. For over a decade, Locusta likely continued to ply her deadly craft for Nero's regime. There are hints, too, that Nero kept her poisons handy. According to later sources, as Nero's own downfall approached in CE 68, he prepared a poison kit from Locusta to take his own life if necessary. But in the end, if you know the story, Nero chose a dagger and the help of a servant to do the deed. So Locusta's parting gift went unused, I suppose. But the table certainly turned after Nero's death. In June 68 CE, the new Emperor Galba came to power, seeking to punish Nero's corrupt entourage. Locusta, as the notorious poisoner-in-chief of the previous reign, was obviously quite a high target. Galba's agents dragged Locusta in chains through the streets of Rome, along with the other palace criminals, a spectacle to signal moral restoration. She was executed, likely via public humiliation and death, though methods vary in accounts. And thus ended Locusta's remarkable and admittedly unique career. In perhaps 15 years, she had likely killed or helped kill an untold number of victims at the behest of Agrippina and Nero, certainly Claudius and Britannicus, but possibly others whose names never really reached the history books. This makes her one of antiquity's clearest examples of a serial killer. Multiple murders, separated in time, carried out with cunning and consistent method. Unlike a modern serial killer who acts independently, Locusta was more like a contract killer, but her repeated acts and the obvious sadistic expertise put her in the same grim category. Her name became proverbial in Rome. Juvenal, writing a generation later, could assume his audience knew her infamy. In one satire, he describes a dreadful poisoner as even more skilled than, quote, the infamous Locusta. In the Roman imagination, Locusta was the archetype of the evil crone with a poison vial, so much that her name lived on for centuries as a byword for murderous treachery. Even Alexandre Dumas, over 1800 years later, named a chapter Locusta in the Count of Monte Cristo to evoke that legacy. Well, truly, hers is a case where history and legend blend. A real woman whose serial murders at the heart of Roman power secured her a kind of dark immortality. And so before we leave the topic of poisoners, it's worth noting that Locusta was not alone. She may have been the most famous, but Roman history hints at other serial poisoners. We mentioned Martina in the Germanicus case. There was also Canidia, a fictionalized witch in Horace's poems, but likely inspired by real rumors of a lethal sorceress. The prevalence of such figures in the Latin term venefica, female poisoner or witch, shows the Romans lived with a fear of repeat poison murderers, akin to how later societies feared serial killers. It was a crime that particularly terrified them because it was stealthy, intimate, and often struck in one's own household. But having examined these covert killers, let's now turn to the higher echelons of power, where the serial killing often happened right there in plain sight. The emperors of Rome, wielding absolute authority over life and death, and a few wielded it with a homicidal glee that earns them a place in any catalogue of serial murder. You see, when power is concentrated in the hands of just one person, the result can be pretty deadly, especially if that person just so happens to delight in cruelty. Several Roman emperors, through their abusive reigns, committed serial killings on a grand scale. They didn't stalk strangers in the night with a dagger hidden in their pocket. Instead, they murdered family members, courtiers, senators, and citizens, one after the other, often with sadistic creativity. And so we will focus on three notorious examples: Caligula, Nero, and Commodus, starting, of course, with Caligula, moving through them. But each of these emperors performed what we might call serial killings, though in the context of autocratic rule. Their specific acts and the cultural memory of their deeds have made them enduring symbols of tyranny and madness. So let's start. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known by his nickname Caligula, which by the way means little boots, which is just adorable, but I'm not going to hop on about that. Well, he ruled from 37 to 41 CE. He started off as a beloved 24-year-old emperor, son of the hero Germanicus. But after only a few months, something in Caligula seemed to have snapped. Ancient writers suggest an illness or brain fever unhinged his mind, and the result was a brief reign of horrific cruelty. Caligula's murders were numerous and often perversely whimsical, earning him a reputation as a psychotic killer. Suetonius, writing about 70 years later, paints Caligula as practically reveling in killing. At public games, if the crowd displeased him, Caligula would growl, quote, "I wish the Roman people had but one neck, so we could decapitate them all with a single blow." This ghastly wish shows Caligula's approach to power and murder. He viewed people as playthings on whom he could inflict death at a whim. His specific acts of serial murder are documented in chilling detail. He had his own cousin, an adopted son, Tiberius Gemellus, quietly killed after initially sparing him, and he forced Macro to take his own life, the Praetorian prefect who had helped him to the throne. He exiled and later executed his two surviving sisters, Agrippina and Julia, after accusing them of adultery and treason. He took particular delight in tormenting Roman senators and equestrians too. At dinner parties, he'd suddenly burst into laughter, and when asked why, casually announced that, "I was just thinking that I have only to give one nod, and both of your throats would be cut on the spot." And that was not an empty boast. Caligula did have high-ranking Romans executed for trivial reasons, or sometimes just no reason at all. There was an infamous example of his sadism. During a lavish public banquet, Caligula noticed that one of his slaves had stolen a bit of silver decoration. Probably not a very wise choice on the slave's behalf, but Caligula immediately ordered the slave's hands to be cut off, and then had the severed hands hung around the slave's neck with a placard listing his crime, parading him around the guests. In another episode, Caligula arranged for several retiarus gladiators, that is, net fighters, to face heavily armed opponents. When the net fighters yielded in fear, Caligula was so enraged by their cowardice that he ordered all of them killed. One quick-thinking fighter grabbed a sword and managed to slay the victors, prompting Caligula to declare that a massacre had occurred and lament that the audience had witnessed such a cruel sight. The emperor's hypocrisy here is quite stunning. He planned to kill them himself, yet when someone else did it out of desperation, he acted appalled. Maybe he was just a little upset that he'd been robbed of the pleasure. But his cruelty extended even to his closest circles. The ancient sources alleged he killed for personal gratification as much for paranoia. He forced parents to watch the executions of their sons. He reportedly would say to Empress Caesonia while caressing her neck, "So beautiful a throat. Cut it whenever I please." There are also stories of Caligula engaging in sexual violence and then killing the victims of their relatives afterwards, blurring the line between lust and murder. But within just 4 years, Caligula likely ordered or personally caused dozens, if not hundreds of deaths, rivaling the body count of any modern serial killer, albeit over the cover of law. The cultural memory of Caligula is one of unfettered madness. After he was assassinated by his own guards in CE 41, a fate he perhaps sealed openly by mocking and threatening them once too often, the Senate attempted to erase his memory. Yet the stories of his sadism were simply too lurid to forget. Caligula became a byword for insane tyranny. Later Roman historians fixated on his reign as a cautionary tale of absolute power's corruption. For example, Suetonius recounts how people still shuddered remembering Caligula's atrocious deeds later on. In modern times, Caligula's name evokes a kind of decadent cruelty, thanks in part to these serial acts of murder that emblazoned him in history as one of the monsters of Rome. Well, of course, we can't go past Nero, though, can't we? When you talk about monsters of Rome. We've already encountered Nero, Claudius, Caesar when we discussed Locusta, as he was the mastermind behind some of her murders. But Nero's reputation as a killer comes not only from those poisonings, but a broader pattern of bloodshed through his 14-year reign, that is, 54 to 68 CE. Early in his rule, Nero was guided by tutors, and seemed reluctant to get his hands dirty, but as he grew older and more independent, he developed into a murderer with somewhat of a theatrical flair, befitting an emperor who fancied himself an artist above all. His killings often targeted his own family and inner circle, eliminating anyone who threatened his security or his ego. His first notable murder was indeed Britannicus in 55, which we have covered and we won't go into anymore. But next he turned to his own mother, Agrippina. Well, Agrippina had been the power behind the throne, but as Nero chafed under her influence, he decided to have her removed in 59. The matricide of Agrippina is one of the most famous murders in Roman history. Tacitus details Nero's elaborate, almost farcical plot. He arranged for Agrippina's boat to collapse at sea in a staged accident. But Agrippina survived the collapse and swam ashore, only slightly injured. Frustrated, Nero then sent an assassin, or perhaps a team of soldiers, to her villa to finish the job. Agrippina was then stabbed to death, and Nero made it look like she was caught in a treasonous act. When a messenger came and told Nero that his mother had died, Nero's reply was, "Let's go see her corpse." Well, not out of any mourning, but rather to ensure that the deed was done. Suetonius claims that Nero examined Agrippina's body and remarked how beautiful she had once been, showing no remorse for having killed his own mother. This was a serial killing in the psychological sense, you see. Nero struck down a close relative after Britannicus, exhibiting a developing pattern of eliminating those close to him. But he didn't stop there. He disposed of his first wife, Octavia, in 62, banishing her, and later ordering her execution on false charges of adultery. All of this because he wanted to marry Poppaea Sabina. The Roman public loved the innocent Octavia, so much that her death caused an outcry too. In AD 65, Nero kicked Poppaea, who was pregnant, to death in a fit of sudden rage, an impulsive act that claimed the lives of both his second wife and the unborn child. Though this may not have been premeditated, it certainly added to Nero's bloody tally of family members killed. Moreover, after the Pisonian conspiracy against Nero in 65 was uncovered, Nero embarked on a purge. He executed his old tutor, Seneca, forcing him to take his own life, a pretty common method, back to the old Greek days of the hemlock drinking. And also the poet Lucan, among others, were on the list. Not necessarily because they were all guilty in the plot, but more to rid himself of critics and potential enemies. Didn't want anyone writing anything that would make him look bad. Tacitus recounts of how Nero seemed to revel in signing death warrants during this time. In fact, Nero's killings often had a performative element, After Agrippa's murder, he staged extravagant games supposedly to honor his departed mother, during which he sang and played music, as if celebrating matricide with an artistic flourish. Following the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, Nero famously blamed the Christians and subjected them to grotesque executions, apparently burning them as human torches in his gardens and feeding them to beasts. This was mass murder rather than serial murder, but it certainly cemented his image as monstrously cruel. In the context of serial killing, what stands out is Nero's emotional detachment and creative cruelty in each successive case. He killed his stepbrother, then his mother, then his wife, and technically his child, and then countless others, each by different methods: poison, engineering, accidents, forcing them under compulsion to do it themselves, kicking them to death, almost as if experimenting with different kinds of ways to kill people. Of course, the cultural memory of Nero is quite complex. Unlike Caligula and Commodus, Nero actually retained some popular sympathy after his death, especially among the lower classes who enjoyed his public entertainments. In fact, for years after Nero's death in AD 68, rumors persisted that he was still alive in the East, plotting to return, the so-called Nero redivivus. Some commoners laid flowers on his tomb for a long time, indicating a lingering affection. This is perhaps because Nero, despite his crimes, styled himself as more of a populist showman. However, among the elites and later historians, he was remembered as an archetypal villain. Christian authors, in particular, dubbed him the first persecutor of the church. Lactantius called him that, quote, noxious wild beast who slayed Peter and Paul. St. Augustine and others even connected Nero with the apocalyptic figure of the Antichrist. Suetonius, well, he tells us that decades after Nero's death, when a false Nero impostor arose in Parthia, the mere name of Nero was still enough to incite hope or dread. The Parthians supported this fake Nero, quote, vigorously, and only surrendered him with a great reluctance, so fond were they of Nero's memory. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Senate had damnatio memoriae decrees against him, erasing his statues and inscriptions. Thus, I suppose we can say that Nero is culturally remembered both as a depraved artist tyrant and oddly a figure of fascination that some were just unwilling to let go. His killings, particularly of his own kin, became central episodes in every account of his reign, ensuring he would feature in both histories and lurid legends long after the Julio-Claudian line had come to an end. Well, our final imperial case study is Commodus, who reigned from 180 to 192 CE, a life story that plays out like another twisted horror film. He was the son of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, but the apple had certainly fallen far from the tree. He showed none of his father's famous virtue and restraint. Taking power at 19 years old, he squandered the goodwill of Marcus's reign and descended into debauchery and violence. Ancient historians, Herodian, Cassius Dio, and the author of the Historia Augusta unanimously condemn him as cruel, lewd, and a megalomaniacal ruler. Within that portrayal, we of course find numerous acts of killing that qualify as serial murders, fueled by Commodus's vanity and cruelty. Commodus is infamously known for his obsession with the gladiatorial arena. Unlike any emperor before, he personally fought as a gladiator hundreds of times in public. While these contests were usually rigged, as no one dared harm the emperor, Commodus took them very seriously, and they provided an outlet for his bloodlust. According to the Historia Augusta, Commodus fought in the arena 365 times, and slayed both men and wild beasts in great numbers with his own hand. Though the exact numbers are likely exaggerated, certainly no doubt that Commodus killed many opponents in the arena, including helpless victims. One particularly heinous spectacle, Commodus gathered men who were disabled or amputees, dressed them as mythic giants with snake-like appendages, gave them flimsy weapons, and then bludgeoned them to death with a club, pretending he was Hercules vanishing giants. Cassius Dio, an eyewitness to this, recounts it with palpable horror. The Roman senators, watching Commodus commit mass murder of the defenseless men purely for entertainment, was the last straw. Dio notes that fear was shared by all, as they realized that no one was safe from the emperor's caprice. Commodus's serial killings extend beyond the arena. He indulged in executing members of the elite with as little mercy as he showed the, quote, giants. He had a long list of senators put to death, often on trumped-up charges, simply because they displeased him, or because he had a feeling that they were plotting. In all fairness, sometimes they were, as plots did spring up in reaction to his misrule, but one can hardly blame them for that, can't we? Dio records that Commodus, quote, killed a great many people, some openly and some by secret poison, making away with practically all those who had attained eminence during his father's reign and his own. The only prominent men he spared were those who flattered him relentlessly, or whom he found useful. A few, like the general Pompeianus, survived by staying utterly neutral and low profile, and this indicates a systematic purge over years, Commodus eliminating any distinguished person who could challenge him. It's akin to a paranoid serial killer, removing all perceived rivals, I suppose, one by one. And here's something for you. His sister, Lucilla, was one such victim. After she conspired, unsuccessfully, to assassinate him in 182, Commodus exiled and then executed her. He later ordered the execution of his wife Crispina as well on adultery charges, and is said to have personally killed his chamberlain and childhood friend Cleander in a fit of rage. Another gruesome anecdote. At a banquet, Commodus casually decapitated an ostrich and brandished its bleeding head and his sword at the watching senators, wordlessly indicating they could be next. The senators had to stifle nervous laughter at the absurd sight. Dio recounts that he chewed laurel leaves to keep from laughing outright, knowing Commodus would kill anyone he saw laughing at him. The terror that he instilled was very real and very personal. In the end, Commodus's serial killings backfired. By late 192, his mistress Marcia and the Praetorian prefect Laetus feared they were next on the list, and indeed Commodus had begun writing a prescription list that even included those closest to him. They decided, on December 31st, 192, to strike first, poisoning Commodus's wine, which was quite fitting given his own penchant for poison against others. When the poison only made him vomit, like Britannicus before, they panicked and sent in the palace wrestler, a man named, quite ironically, Narcissus, to strangle Commodus in his bath, and thus fell the Gladiator emperor at the age of 31. But the reaction in Rome this time was quite euphoric. Cassius Dio describes how the new Emperor Pertinax and the Roman people declared Commodus a public enemy. The Senate heaped insults on his memory, calling him, quote, that murderer, that gladiator, that ruptured one. By the way, this ruptured one, that's in reference to his apparent hernia. Yes, apparently Commodus had one of them. Probably too much exercise in the gladiatorial arena, perhaps. Hence the term ruptured. But they wanted to drag his corpse too through the streets and mutilate it, as was done to the hated tyrants of old. But Pertinax dissuaded them, since the body was already buried. Instead, they obliterated his statues and renamed the city. Well, by the way, Commodus had grandiosely rebranded Rome, by the way, as Colonia Commodiana. That's right. He changed the name of Rome. Certainly a big deal, that's for sure. The Senate's decree, Damnatio Memoriae, on Commodus was essentially society's way of posthumously executing the serial killer. His cultural memory became that of a degenerate tyrant who fancied himself a reincarnation of Hercules. Later historians like Dio, who had suffered through his reign, never forgave him. The Historia Augusta outright calls Commodus a pestilence and lists his vices and killings exhaustively. And so he was remembered as the man who nearly wrecked the empire through his vanity and violence. Only in modern popular culture, like the film Gladiator, by the way, has Commodus been somewhat romanticized, but even there he's a villain still. For his contemporaries, he was a real-life nightmare, an emperor who personally and repeatedly murdered for both malice and sport. So, having surveyed individual cases, let's take a step back and consider how Roman law and culture dealt with serial killers, even of course if they lacked the term. We've touched on the legal developments, but late Republic laws like Sulla's Lex Cornelia targeted at habitual murders, especially poisoners. The fact that Sulla's law lumped serial killers, sicari, literally knife men or assassins, and poisoners together is quite telling. Both were seen as stealthy threats to public order who could strike multiple times. Under the Lex Cornelia, someone who committed repeated or premeditated murder faced exile or execution, and this statute remained the backbone of homicidal law into the empire. Over time, Roman jurists and Senate decrees fine-tuned punishments to cover scenarios of serial murder. For example, repeat poisoners could be punished, even if intent, not just result, was proven. Possessing poison became a crime, you see. A decree under Augustus or Tiberius empowered special trials for poisoning that might span multiple incidents, essentially an ancient version of investigating a serial killing spree. The Romans, as pragmatic as ever, responded to waves of murders, like those poison panics, by creating investigative commissions. In 331 BC, there was no precedent, but by the 2nd century, the Senate regularly tasked praetors to investigate beneficia systematically. We read that in 184 BC, one such investigation in Italy led to 2,000 people being condemned for poisoning. That's if we trust Valerius of Antium's possibly exaggerated number. Whether or not the number is accurate, the key point is this. Serial murder via poison was seen as a collective crisis, and the Roman authorities responded with broad sweeps and mass trials. Something akin to a witch hunt, I suppose. But unfortunately, like later witch hunts, sometimes innocent people were likely caught up into the dragnet of public hysteria. Culturally, the Roman reaction to serial killers combined fear, suspicion, and ultimately swift retribution. The 331 BCE episode was so shocking that, as Livy said, people thought that women must have just gone insane en masse or been cursed. The Romans even resorted to a religious expiation. They appointed a dictator, ceremonially nail in the evil, a ritual normally done to calm social order. All this shows that serial murders were sometimes outside Romans' normal frame of reference. They interpreted them as prodigies, these supernatural omens. In later times, when serial killers took forms of emperors like Caligula or Nero, some Romans similarly rationalized that the gods must have abandoned these men to madness. Suetonius recounts various omens and dreams that supposedly forewarned of Nero's and Caligula's bloody tendencies. In St. Augustine's work, The City of God, he even cites the 331 BCE poisonings as evidence of the moral bankruptcies of Rome's old gods, noting how such horrors happened under pagan watch. On a societal level, Romans dealt with known serial killers harshly when they could. Once an emperor serial killer died, the Senate almost always moved to condemn the memory. Statues were toppled, coins defaced. Rome tried to excise the cancer retroactively. In the case of Locusta, as we saw, Galba made a public example of her, executing her to a delighted Roman public who had long feared her lethal talent. Execution for some serial killers in Rome could be spectacular. Poena culae for parricides, a gruesome drowning in a sack with animals, or being thrown to wild beasts. Perhaps crucifixion for slaves, although crucifixion was not allowed for Roman citizens, by the way. The worse the crime, the more extreme the punishment, especially if multiple victims were involved. But there's also evidence that Romans told cautionary tales about serial killers as a way to scare or educate. Much as we have true crime stories, the Romans circulated stories of, let's say, wives who had poisoned successive husbands as a kind of moral lesson. Valerius Maximus includes tales of husband murdering wives in his memorable deeds and sayings, under exemplar of evil women. One such tale is a wife named Hostia, who poisoned 2 husbands in a row and was finally caught. A likely fictionized composite, but quite instructive. Similarly, in popular lore, the idea of witches who kill infants or evil innkeepers who had poisoned travelers show up in plays and novels. Petronius hints at such things if you're familiar with that work. These reflect a societal awareness that random serial murders could happen, even if they were couched in myth. But the Romans also seem to have felt a mix of fascination and revulsion toward these figures, kind of like in our modern day, to be honest. People would flock to see an emperor like Commodus perform his killings in the arena, even as they secretly detested him. The spectacle of violence in amphitheaters possibly inured Romans somewhat to repeated killings, as long as it was framed as entertainment or punishment. But a sudden rash of unexplained murders like poisonings, that would induce panic. In 331, people were so frightened that even after the perpetrators died, the city needed ritual cleansing. In 186, during the Bacchanalian conspiracy, there were rumors that the Bacchus cult members were murdering people as part of their rites. The Senate reacted with draconian force, executing many and banning the cult. Just another example of how serial murder fears could drive social repression. And so, as we conclude, in a very real sense, discussing these psychotic murderers in ancient Rome, it's not just academic or antiquarian. It's a reminder that extreme criminal behavior is a recurring aspect of human civilization. The Romans, with their mix of pragmatism and superstition, show us early attempts to grapple with such evil. And by studying them, we not only gain vivid historical insight, but we can also reflect on the universality of crime and the perennial challenge of understanding what drives a person to become a serial killer. So thank you very much for your attention today. I hope that our exploration of Rome's darkest characters has been as enlightening as it was frightening. And just remember, history is always full of lessons, even from its most sinister figures. I suppose, as the Romans would say after a grim tale, valete, farewell, and stay vigilant. Well, everyone, we've reached the end of another video. I hope you enjoyed today's one. Interesting, don't you think? I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters, the reason why you did not get any ads in the video. If you want to support, you can find on Patreon or YouTube memberships. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfidnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Nero Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Darvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu, Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, and Neftis. Thank you so much, everybody. And that is it from me today. I do hope you've enjoyed our time together, and I do hope that perhaps you'll cover your drink in the future, that no Roman poisoners are coming after you. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all out there in the world. See you next time.